The main focus of this tutorial is to look at the dynamic paint function in Blender. So if you want to skip to just that, the time will be in the description. Throughout the beginning of the tutorial, I look at very basic fluid simulation. So if you already know how to do that, check that link in the description and it will take you to the dynamic paint tutorial. Alright, here is a quick tutorial, relatively quick tutorial on how to use the dynamic paint modifier function in Blender 2.79. I'm making this tutorial because it's something that I wanted to do for quite a while, but I couldn't find many tutorials on how to do it, particularly using the cycles renderer. So I figured once I figured it out, it'd be good to share with people who are just getting into it and wanting to find out a little bit more about how to use it, or they just want to get going quickly with it. So this is basically what I'm going to be making, something very similar to this, probably a more simplified version, just using fluid to reveal another shader or another material from underneath a base material. So anyway, yeah, I'm going to jump into Blender. Again, like I said, 2.79, could use 2.78 if you want, but you know, it's still a little bit unstable, so I'm not going to bother. So starting with the default cube, don't know why I just deleted it, but I'm going to hit I'm going to hit S and then Shift Z to just scale it on just the X and Y, and scale it down on the Z. Obviously you could just go, you know, S8, bring it down on the Z. Doesn't matter how you want to do it, but that's how I'm going to do it. So what we're going to do first is set up the scene and animate the emitter, the fluid emitter. So I'm going to add a UV sphere. I'm going to go to the top view, orthographic view. I'm going to hit G and then Shift Z again because we don't want it moving on that axis. Position it down in this corner. Hit I to insert a location keyframe. And go forward to say frame 50, G, Shift Z, move it over here, and making sure on frame 50, I, location. So now you got very simple animation. I'm just going to move my camera, G, hit Z twice to track it outwards, R, X twice, and G again, just like that. That's just for the final render. That's, you know, it's not really important for the effect at all. So you got your simple animation there. So that's going to be the fluid emitter. This is going to be the obstacle. So now we're going to create the domain, just as a cube. Hit S8. We go into the side view. Hit Z to go into wireframe mode. Shift Z to bring it down. And you want to just capture the obstacle in the emitter. So I'm going to go into edit mode. Hit A. And hit B to just select these top vertices here, making sure I'm on wireframe mode so I get all of them, and just drag them just above the emitter there. You could even go halfway through if you want, but you know, I'm just gonna encapsulate it there. Go out of edit mode. So now you can see you've got this domain around it. So I'm actually gonna move it, hit M, move it to another layer just so that it's out of the way for now. And then when we go to actually use it, you can hit Shift, click on this other layer down here to get them both together. Okay, so now what we're gonna want to do is set up the actual fluid simulation here. So I'm going to select the emitter first, or the sphere that's going to be the emitter. I'm going to go to the physics tab, fluid, and change it to inflow. You could do it as a fluid if you want. It just depends the type of effect you're going for, but I'm going to go with inflow. Change it to both for the volume initialization. You could do shell, you could do volume. I'm just going to do both because why not? It's easy. I'm going to select the floor here, which I'm actually going to rename to floor. Rename the sphere to emitter. And then this other cube, which is the one on this layer, rename that to domain. Go back to our main layer, select the floor again, fluid, and obstacle, and change it to shell, so this is the outer shell that is colliding with. Leave it on partial slip and then just bring that down so that you don't get too much like slippage and then stick. It's just sort of a more natural fluid sort of look. Obviously if you want no slip, it's basically no friction, the fluid just glosses right over it, and then no slip is full friction, it literally doesn't slip, and free slip is just lack of friction. So I'm going to go partial so you get some particles that are sticking to it and some that aren't. Then I'm going to select the domain, which you don't have to be able to see, but if you want to see it, move to that layer, fluid, domain, there. So this is where you control the resolution of the simulation. This is just like, it's picking up on a cache from a previous simulation. That's alright. I suppose I could actually use that, to be honest. It would make things a little bit quicker, but I'm not going to do it. I'm going to bake it anyway. So the final resolution, I'm just literally just going to put at 75. I know it's not very high, but for the sake of making this tutorial, and because I'm impatient, just going to put it at 75, change the viewport display to final, so that you can actually, once it's done, you can see what it actually looks like versus just, like a crappy sort of low poly version of it. I'm actually just going to select both layers, like I said, shift, click both layers, go to the beginning frame. I'm going to change it to 100 frames, and I'm actually just going to move that. Sorry. No, I'm not. I'm just going to move that up and give myself another timeline there, because I have my taskbar set to do that every time I touch it, which is nice because it gives me a little bit more screen real estate, but every time I go to hit that play button, I generally hit that, which is why, actually, here's a note for Blender 2.8. They have the playback controls at the top of the timeline bar, which is really nice. I don't know if that was the problem that they were trying to fix with doing that, or if it was just a general user interface change, but that's something that I really like. So if anyone from Blender is watching, good job. That's top marks from me. Anyway, so I'm going to go to the first frame and just bake that. It's it's only 100 frames, fairly low resolution, so it's not going to take too long to do. Just cut to the end of it anyway. Okay, so now what you're going to see when you play it back is just this, very simple fluid animation. I'm going to go press 5 on the number pad, keypad, to go out of orthographic mode. Very, very simple. You could set it to smooth shading, but obviously it doesn't work particularly well depending on what the resolution of your domain is. You could add some subdivisions to that if you want. It kind of helps, but I like to keep it flat and then instead use a subdivision surface modifier, which just tends to give slightly cleaner results, and then you can go smooth after that if you want. But I'm actually going to turn off the visibility for that modifier at the moment, because as you can see, when you've got it on, it kind of makes the animation go a little bit slowly. Whereas if you've got it off, you can scrub through it in pretty much real time. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the materials for each object here. So the floor here, I'm going to set it up. Oh, make sure you're in cycles, by the way. And I'm just going to save it here. Tutorial. Just save over that. Yeah, whatever, tutorial. Yeah, whatever. Just make sure you save it, basically. So the floor material, just going to add a new diffuse. Doesn't matter what color it is for the moment. You can do whatever you want. Do whatever color you want. Use an image texture if you want to do that. But for the sake of this, I'm just going to leave it as a diffuse. But then I'm going to open up a node editor window and just set up this little system that we're going to have going here. So I'm actually going to add a glass texture, glass shader, by the way, and a mix shader, and put that in between so that they're both contributing to the material of this object. Change the color of the gloss just to like a red or a pink or whatever, and change it to blue, so that you just got two different colors, just so that I can show you the discernible difference between the what the wet map creates. And then I'm going to go to the actual fluid itself, the domain setup, node setup for that. I'm going to make it a glass shader, because that's, I'm going for sort of a water kind of material. I'm going to set the index of refraction to 1.35. I think it might be 1.36 actually for water, but who cares? I'm not going for accuracy. So then if you go into your rendered view, you can see you've got sort of this really dark setup actually. So what I'm going to do is go back into the material view and go to my world tab, use nodes, background surface, and environment texture. I'm going to open up a high dynamic range image, and then just delete this lamp here because it's unnecessary. Now if I go into my render view, you can actually kind of like see the materials at work. So the glass, you got the glass material. I'm actually going to change the color of this to just white for now, and then maybe make that blue. Yeah, that's fine. Let's go with that. So you got the glass material, you got your floor material. That's all well and good. I'm gonna go out of that for now. I'm gonna go back into the physics tab on the floor material, on the floor object. minimize the fluid tab and click on dynamic paint. You're going to make sure it's selected canvas, add canvas. And I'm going to use the vertex painting method as opposed to the image sequence method, just because I don't know, it's more interesting, and there's not as many tutorials on it. So what you also want to do before we go any further is go into edit mode on the floor, and just if you just get rid of that, go into edit mode, and you want to subdivide this face quite a few times. So you want to give it enough vertices to actually paint onto. Subdivide it like that, quite a few times. Obviously, the more subdivisions you have, the higher the resolution of the paint map will be. But I think that's probably enough for now. It won't be super high resolution, but it'll be good enough. Then I'm going to reselect that layer. Go into the fluid physics tab on the fluid object, dynamic paint. This time select brush, add brush, and change the dynamic paint source to mesh volume plus proximity, and just change the paint distance to like 0.2. So the paint distance is how far essentially it spreads away from the object, hence proximity. And I'll leave it as blue just so that you can see what it does here. So you can see as the fluid collides with the canvas, which is the floor, it paints on this color. And if you change the paint distance, you can see how far the paint goes away from the actual fluid. I'm gonna leave it at 0.2, or in fact, no, I'm gonna go 0.1. I've just done 0.2 again. That's hilarious. I'm gonna go 0.1. No, I'm gonna go 0.2 anyway. So then what we want to do is we want to select the floor again, go down to dynamic paint cache, which these buttons won't be selectable unless you've saved. So obviously save it as somewhere, which you should have done before anyway, but just a reminder if you haven't already. Just click free all bakes just to make sure that there's no cache that it's drawing from. Obviously you saw it earlier, it was drawing from a previous simulation cache. So just click free all bakes just to make sure that it's brand new. And if you go to the object data tab, should be nothing nothing in here, no attributes in there, which is good. So then what you want to do is, once you've got like your simulations baked, you're happy with how it looks, I'm actually going to change the color to pure white, and that's because I'm going to be using it as a mask to reveal these two. I'm using it as a mask to reveal this glossy shader on top of the diffuse shader. So it's going to be pure white. So if you see, it's just like pure white underneath. So then once you've done that, go back to the floor, dynamic paint cache tab, and just bake it. So go back to the first frame and bake. Okay, now what that's done is that it's basically, it's baked the paint onto the surface. So if you go to the dynamic paint output, you got two options here: paint map and wet map. Wet map is basically exactly what it says. It paints the color on as essentially moisture, which will then evaporate or just fade out after a few seconds. So I've currently got it on paint as a preview. If I change it to wet map, the white sort of like fades to gray after a couple seconds, and that's because it's emulating sort of like evaporating. So that's the difference between a paint map and a wet map. A paint map, it'll stay on. It'll just like stay that color. It'll just be on there until you decide that it's time for it to like come off or delete or whatever. Whereas a wet map will evaporate on its own. So I'm gonna leave it as a paint map for now. So what you want to do is, whichever one you decide to do, click the plus next to it. So I'm gonna click next to paint map. I'm gonna click plus. So what that's gonna do is it's gonna add this little attribute here called DP paint map, dynamic paint map. So now when you go into the material settings, the node setup for the floor, I'm going to add an attribute node. So I'm going to add attribute. I'm going to put it just up here, and this basically is going to drive the factor, the difference between these two shaders here. So I'm going to hover over this, select it, hit Control C to copy the name. You could obviously type it in as well, but it's easier just to hit Control C, Control V, enter, paste it into the attribute. And then you want to connect the color attribute, color of the attribute node, into the factor of the mix shader. So that basically says, as the color is changed on this attribute node, it'll change the factor of the mix shader. So 0 is the first shader, 1 is a glossy, and anywhere in between is a mix of anywhere in between. So because we've set the color of the paint map to white, it's essentially it's a binary. It's going to ignore all these interim like middle settings or like values, and it's going to go from 0 straight to 1. So that way you don't have the mix between the two colors. You've just got it painting this color directly on top of that color, which is quite cool. So I'll plug the factor back into there. So now if you go back into the render view, you can see that as the fluid comes on, it's not going to look great, but as the fluid comes on, it actually changes from just the regular gray diffuse, or white gray diffuse, to this blue glass, and I can change the color of that a bit more to show you. Obviously it's showing through it's diffusing through this glass shader, so I'm actually going to change that just to like just a regular diffuse, I guess, so that way you can see what it's actually doing underneath. So as the fluid comes on, let's make it blue. As the fluid comes on, it is painting this other material onto the base mesh here. So it's painting glossy, shader number 2, on top of diffuse, which is shader number 1. And that's being determined by this attribute node, which is being driven by this vertex attribute here. So this is the basics of dynamic paint and using the vertex format rather than image sequence. Obviously there's quite a few tutorials on how to use the image sequence format, which is why I decided to do vertex instead, because it's something that I was really struggling to figure out. So hopefully this can help anyone who's trying to use it. It's a really useful tool, dynamic paint. I actually used it recently I'm currently using it recently in a project where I'm kind of replicating the opening credits to the Daredevil Netflix TV series, where models and objects are being covered with, well, red liquid, let's say. It's not necessarily blood, but it's blood. So I'm kind of doing the same thing there. So I'm using fluid to, obviously, using the fluid simulation to be the blood, and then adding a wet map on top of that, or underneath it, I suppose, to help the objects look like they've sort of soaked up a little bit of moisture. And it's sort of getting into all the cracks and stuff, which is really cool. And it's working out really well. So yeah, hopefully that clears up any questions that people had. Feel free to, ask any questions in the comments. I'm happy to help as best I can, or direct you to the posts that I used to figure this out. If you need any more answers in terms of rendering, just whatever render setup you use, whatever is the ideal render setup that you want to use, go ahead and use that. Again, this has all been done inside Cycles, so it will work with Cycles. I have no experience doing this with the internal render engine. That's because I just don't use it, because obviously I'm going for a photorealistic or more photorealistic look, and Blender internal does not necessarily capture that. So this has all been done inside Cycles, and yeah, hopefully that helps. So I guess go forth, create. You can create some really cool stuff with dynamic paint. I mean, even that looks really trippy and weird, but it's quite cool. I'm actually just going to change the size of this to sort of more properly match the bounds of the fluid, and make sure that it lines up this way. Yeah, close enough. And there you go. There you have your dynamic paint-ish sort of simulation, whatever you want to call it. I'll render a little image here for you if you want to see it. So there you have it. That's sort of the finished result, I guess, and I don't have any, my samples are pretty low, and I didn't turn on denoising or anything, so it doesn't look brilliant, but that gives you a sort of idea of what you could end up with. Also, one thing that I want to point out is that if you wanted to, I don't know why you would want to, but if you wanted to, you could just hide the domain and just have the wet map show up. It's kind of weird. You could hide the emitter as well, hide that sphere. I don't know why you'd want to do that in an actual project, but it's good for sort of showing you exactly what's going on underneath it. You can actually see, you know, see what the wet map's doing. So that's the map itself, and that's the fluid that is creating that map. When you put them all together, that's what you get. It's pretty cool. So anyway, thanks for watching. Again, let me know in the comments if you have any questions. I can direct you to the posts that taught me how to do this, or I can try and answer them myself. Happy to help if I can. Yeah, thanks.